What is exposure simulation and when should you use it? I'll tell you all about it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a photo question, you should know what to do by now. You just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit that form right there on the site. I just might pick your question to answer here on a future show. Today's question was sent in by JP, and it is, when I'm using flash outdoors during the day, do I turn off exposure simulation? If so, do I turn it back on after, or do I leave it off for the whole shoot? Thank you. Well, thank you, JP, for sending that in. I do appreciate it. Before I answer your specific question, let me explain what we're talking about here so that everyone is up to speed. Now, in the old days of just a few years ago, when we were shooting only with DSLR cameras, you looked at your subject optically. In other words, you looked through the lens, and using a cool system of mirrors in the camera, you could actually see what you were shooting. Then some DSLRs came out with live view mode. The mirror would move out of the way and a digital image would be shown on the screen on the back of the camera. You could still look optically through the viewfinder, but you could also look at a sort of video image on the back and take a picture either way. I always thought it was a bit awkward to shoot using that back screen, but to each their own. Nowadays, many of us are shooting with mirrorless cameras. Not only do they have a digital screen on the back, but since there's no mirror in the camera at all, you can look at a tiny digital display inside the viewfinder. That's often called the EVF, or electronic viewfinder. So that's what you look at when you're composing your photographs before you press the shutter button. You may not be looking at your subject optically anymore, but you can actually see the exposure of your picture in real time before you press the button. That's what exposure simulation is. By the way, you might see that setting called different things even within the same camera brands. The Canon R5, for example, calls it exposure simulation, and the R3 uses the term display simulation. I've also seen it called exposure preview in other cameras. It's all the same thing no matter what it's called. Now what happens is the camera takes into account all three settings of your exposure triangle: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and it shows you exactly what the sensor will be capturing when you push the shutter button. You can see in full manual, as I change any setting, shutter speed in this case, that my image gets lighter or darker. If I take the picture, that's exactly what it will look like. Now, if you're shooting in an automatic mode, the camera will show you what it thinks is the best exposure no matter what. So if I'm in aperture priority mode, for example, this is how the picture will look when I push the shutter. If I change my shutter speed, you don't see any exposure change because that's what aperture priority does, so that the exposure value always stays the same. Now, whether you're in manual or auto, being able to see your exposure before taking the picture is one of the biggest benefits of using a mirrorless camera. When you shoot optically through a DSLR, you just see how your subject looks in real life, but your picture might be brighter or darker based on the exposure settings that you used. So if it's such an awesome feature, why would you ever turn it off? Well, the main reason is when you're using flash. Most of the time with flash, you're going to underexpose the ambient light and then add in the light from your flash to illuminate your subject or the scene. It's not uncommon to want a completely black frame without flash because you want all the light on your subject to be coming from your strobes. So if exposure simulation is on in that case, then you won't be able to see anything through the viewfinder. It's just going to be black. You can't compose your image or even focus on your subject because you can't see anything. Now, I'm not sure if it works this way on all camera systems, but with Canon, when you put a speed light or the wireless transmitter directly on your camera's hot shoe, it automatically disables exposure simulation for you. You'll see an average exposure on the screen, kind of like when you're just looking optically with your eyes. After a few seconds of not touching anything, it will turn back on, so you might see your image get dark. But when you activate focus or half press the shutter button, it disables it again so you can see your image to focus and compose. That's actually a feature, not a bug. Now, I found that to be a little inconsistent with third-party strobes. I do love my Westcott FJ200s and 400s, and I use the FJ X3M wireless transmitter to fire those strobes. Most of the time, it works just like the Canon transmitter, where it automatically turns off exposure simulation. Occasionally, it does not. I do find that it works best if I turn the camera on after the transmitter. Your mileage may vary depending on what brand flash and camera you're using. Now on the Canons, there's also a third setting besides enable or disable. This one has exposure simulation off, but will come on temporarily when you're pushing the depth of field preview button. That's a nice feature if you prefer to shoot with exposure simulation off, but occasionally just want a quick check to see how your exposure looks. Personally, I keep exposure simulation on all the time except when I'm shooting flash. Then I just disable it. I even added the setting in my My Menu section so I can quickly get to it easily without having to hunt for that setting when I need to turn it on or off. Now back to JP's question, should you use exposure simulation when shooting flash outdoors during the day? Well, like I said, in most cases, it will automatically turn off when using flash already. It doesn't matter if you're outside in bright sunlight or inside a dark photo studio. If you're using a third-party flash that doesn't automatically shut it off, or another camera brand that doesn't work the same way as the Canons do, yes, I would absolutely turn off exposure simulation when I'm shooting flash and leave it off for the entire shoot. If it's on, you might have trouble seeing your subject to compose and focus your photo. Exposure simulation has no impact on the photo itself. It's just giving you some help so you can visualize your exposure before taking the picture. JP, I hope that answers your question. Do you all use exposure simulation? Any quirks that you've found that make you leave it on or off? Let me know down in the comments below. Remember, you can send in your own photo questions by going to askdavidbergman.com and filling out that form. If you're not already a subscriber to the Adorama YouTube channel, go ahead and click that subscribe button down below and hit the little bell icon while you're there as well. Thanks so much for joining me, and I hope you come back next time. I'll have another question to answer right here on Ask David Bergman.